Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast. Today, we are reading Hellblazer issue 170. But before we get into that, just a little catch-up on what happened last time. In the last issue, it was kind of a one-shot that was setting up this final arc of Brian Azzarello's run. That's right, if you didn't know, this is the last 5 issues of his run. He ends at issue 174. So in issue 169, John was pretty much just hanging out at a bar the whole time, meeting some people in LA, and having some drinks. But in the background, we were learning about S.W. Manor because we saw him at his house, and we found out that he's obviously not a nice guy. He is kind of just a billionaire who gets whatever he wants, and we saw that in that issue because we met another character that he has sway over, and that is a bishop or a priest that he was talking to who gets him to tell him all the secrets of his parishioners. So they come to confess to him, and then he, every week, goes to S.W. Banner's house and tells S.W. the juicy details. That's pretty much all we got. We just got to learn a little bit more about him and how kind of evil of a person he is. And then we just got to see John have some fun. So I'm assuming since this is the last arc, we're going to see how they kind of intertwine finally. So with that being said, first things first, with the cover of issue 170, we see John standing in what looks like some sort of box, maybe, or a corner. And there's a single light above his head, so there's all these shadows below him. And he's looking down as he smokes, and he's staring at the chalk outline of a body. And we also see that this is written by Brian Azzarello with art by Marcelo Ferruccian. And as we turn to the first page, we see what looks like a crime scene. There are a bunch of police officers pulled up to a curb, and their cars are pointing towards what looks like an alley. And we see a police officer walking out saying, "It's a serious fucking nightmare in there." And another one asks, "Yeah? How so?" And the first officer answers, "Words fall short, man. You gotta see to believe." And then a third officer asks the second officer, "What happened?" But before he gets his answer, we see someone flash a badge, and then one of those officers raises the crime scene tape and lets in Agent Frank Turro. And as he walks under the crime scene tape and past them, we hear the second officer answer the question of the third, saying, "Fuck if I know." Then a different officer begins to walk with Agent Frank Turro down the alley, and as they walk, Frank asks, "What's the name of this place, officer?" And the officer answers, "Doesn't have one, just an address. It's a private club." But as they walk further down the alley, there's some interesting graffiti on the walls that Agent Frank Turro takes note of. They are of some female faces, like licking at a snake. So I guess it just seems it's kind of like, if you know that this sign is painted here, you'll know what's in this club kind of thing. And as Frank sees it, he asks, "What kind of club?" And the officer answers, "A sex club, sir." And Frank Turro gets a big smile on his face and he asks, "Oh yeah? Can I join?" And the officer answers straightly, "That depends. You into whips and chains and shit like that?" And as they go through the entrance doors of this club, Frank Turro replies to the officer saying, "That depends too." Then we get a shot from inside the club as he walks in, and we can see a lot of people are inside, a lot of officers doing interviews and also looking for evidence and clues. But Frank beelines for the obvious detective in the room, and he says, "Detective Havlick?" And the detective, who is a woman in her, I'm going to say early 30s, and she's wearing like a business suit, kind of looks like Scully from the X-Files, but with brown hair instead of red. She looks up at Turro and says, "Yep." And Turro asks, "You ranking?" And she replies, "Yep, yep." And Turro just kind of eyes her and asks, "What do you got for me?" So she begins to walk away from him, and he follows as she answers, "Jack shit on a shingle, unless you tell me who you are." And Frank answers, "Frank Turro, FBI." And then he holds out his badge to her, and she looks at it and gives a little smirk and says, "Nice picture." Then she starts walking again, and he follows as she says, "Mind telling me what the fuck you feds want with this horror show?" And Turro replies, "Mind telling me if you verified the ID on the body?" And as they're walking, it seems like they're walking through a bunch of different either rooms or possibly hallways. And the hallways are lined with like riveted metal. So it looks like an industrial kind of club or something. And finally, they get to a door, and Havlik opens it and answers Turo's question, saying, "Ain't much of a verifiable body anymore, Agent. And as for ID, all we got is a name." And Turo asks, "And that's?" And as they walk into the room, Detective Havlik answers, "Constantine, John Constantine." And we get a pretty good view of the room that they walk into from above, and we see there is a burned body that's pretty much immolated. You can't tell any features about it, and it is outlined in chalk in the center of the room. And then we see hanging from the ceiling a bunch of handcuffs and hooks that you can hang from, and a chair with spikes on it that you can sit in, I guess, and get pleasured while also feeling a bunch of pain. Because like the officer outside said, this is definitely some sort of S&M sex dungeon club. We also see some officers talking to some half-naked women who are standing in like dominatrix leather gear. And there's some photographers on the scene taking pictures of the dead, burned body in the center, and also a guy taking evidence and putting it into evidence bags. And we also see the name of this issue is Ashes and Dust in the City of Angels, Part 1. So Frank walks over to the burned body in the center of the room, and he looks at it and he says, "God damn, that smell." And Detective Havlik says, "You could say that again." And then I'm not sure if Turo is just joking or if he's trying to like play the tough guy here, but he says, "Like bacon, makes me hungry." And he kind of grins as he says that, and Havlik says to him sarcastically, "Well, the vegetables will be ready any second if you can wait." And Frank asks, "Vegetables? Witnesses, you mean?" And Havlik answers, "No, it was just a joke." And as Turo is looking down at the body of John, or supposedly body of John, he notices in the burned dead hand of this corpse is a fresh cigarette. We don't really see what he makes of that, we just see that he notices it. And then he stands up and he laughs at the joke that Havlik made, and then he asks, "What about witnesses?" And it just so happens that as he asks that, a couple of people who we can assume either go to the club or work at the club walk by because they're wearing very revealing leather garments. There's a woman whose breasts are out, and she has like thigh-high boots and a leather corset. And then the man behind her is very buff, and he's just wearing like a bikini brief in leather and some leather-studded gauntlets that look like they're from Judas Priest or something, and a collar. And Turo is looking at them as they walk by, and to his question of what about witnesses, Havlik answers, "For what it's worth, I've got a handful." And then Turo continues to watch the witnesses walk by him and out the room, and he kind of gives a smirk and he says, "When in Rome, huh? I want to talk to them." And then he walks over to the spiky chair in the corner, and he puts one of his fingers on one of the spikes to see how sharp it is, and Havlik says, "All right, I'll have my office contact you when we do the interviews. Should be within 48 hours. But Turo replies, "Sounds swell, only I'm getting started tonight." And then he brings his finger up to look to see if there's any blood drawn from that spike, and as he does, Havlik, who I guess thinks he's maybe joking or just is thinking this guy's full of himself, kind of smiles and says, "That's not going to happen." And Turo asks, "No?" And she answers, "No. Welcome to LA Police Procedure 101, Agent Turo. Some of the witnesses," but she's cut off by Turo interrupting, who says, "Do me a big favor. Call them suspects." But Havlik just continues speaking as if he didn't interrupt her, saying, "Are rich, famous, or both? The minute I tell them we're going downtown for questioning is the second they pull their cell phones out of their codpieces, or ass cheeks," and Turo interjects, "or from between a rack of men-made fun bags." And Havlik replies, "Sure, and when we get to the station, we'll find it crawling with attorneys, each one singing the same song." Then Turo pulls out a latex glove and he puts it on his hand, and as he does that he says, "Then go convince the suspects it's their civic duty to cooperate and leave their lawyers out of this." Then he reaches up and he starts playing with one of the chains hanging from the ceiling with his gloved hand, and Havlik watches him do this and asks, "How am I supposed to do that?" And Turo answers, "You fucking tell them if they don't play ball, we're leaking their names to the media. I'm sure Joe 9 to 5 in Susie grocery store would be all hot to hear how the rich and famous get their rocks off in Sodom and Gomorrah." And then it seems like maybe there was some kind of residue on the chain he was looking at with his glove, because he's rubbing his fingers together looking at it, and as he does that, Havlik says, "You don't understand these types of people or how they work." And Turo says, maybe not. And then he reaches into his breast pocket and he pulls out a baggie of something and he says, what's this? And Detective Havlick looks at it and says, looks like heroin. And as Turo smudges the bag with whatever was on that chain, he says, it certainly does. A lot of it. What's it doing here? And Detective Havlick says, confused, you just, but Turo finishes her sentence saying, found it here. And then he holds the bag out towards her, and she reaches to take it, and then they both look at each other with a very serious face, and Turo says, what was that about not understanding how things work, Detective? Then we turn the page, and we cut to the police precinct. We see some cops outside just hanging out, and then inside we cut into an interrogation room, where there's a heavyset white guy sitting at a table shirtless. He might be pantsless, we can't really see. And he's got long black hair, and he looks just kind of like he's been waiting there for a while. But he looks up as the door opens, and we see Agent Turo walk in, and he says, hi, Milton. And Milton says, hi. And Frank continues, my name's Agent Turo. And then he goes over to the chair across the table and sits in it, and Milton says, that's a funny name. And Frank's a little confused, and he asks, is it? How so? And Milton says, I mean, Agent, it's not like Bob or Tim. But then Turo cuts him off, interjecting, or Milton. And Milton thinks about that for a second, and he says, I guess. And Turo says, you guess? What do you know? And Milton answers, not much. And Turo says, I'm not talking about in general, Milton. And then Milton gives a big yawn, and he says, sorry. And Turo asks, you tired? And Milton answers, it's late, right? And Turo says, I guess. And we also see in this panel that there is a tape recorder recording in the room next to them behind the two-way glass. And Milton continues, then I guess I'm tired. I mean, I know I am. And Turo asks, what do you think I want to know, Milton? And Milton answers, what happened? And Turo says, yeah, I do. So? And Milton says, I don't know. And Turo loosens his tie a little bit and says, tell me anyway. So Milton leans forward on the table and rubs his head and he says, some guy, John, I think his name was, got burned. And Turo asks, you think his name was John? And Milton answers, yeah, I think so, I guess. I'm not good with names. And Turo is getting kind of frustrated, I guess, because he stands up a little, leaning forward on the table imposingly, and he asks, what are you good with? And Milton answers, I don't know. Then Frank stands up and he says, you do know you're really pushing my buttons, right? And Milton answers, don't mean to. And at that yawn, Turo snaps angrily, then why don't you fucking stop? And then he gets into Milton's face, and Milton looks up very kind of sad looking, I guess, and he asks, what do you want from me? And Turo answers, I said fucking stop. And Milton, who's getting kind of aggravated, says, I'm not doing anything. And then Turo stands up straight and he begins to walk behind Milton and he says, and that's the problem, Milton. I need you to tell me something so I don't throw your flabby, do-nothing ass in jail with some folks who know exactly what to do with it. And Milton looks very scared at the thought of that. And then there's silence as Frank just stands over him waiting. But Milton doesn't say anything. He just continues to be scared. And so Frank leans down and puts his hand on Milton's shoulders and gets really close to Milton's ear. And he says, wait a minute. You'd like that, wouldn't you? And then Milton says, I'm bi if that's what you're asking. But Turo pops back up straight and he walks over to the side of the table and he says, I don't give a pope shit about you, Milton. Tell me about John. Now, Milton didn't have a shirt on, but he did have some kind of blanket. And as Turo was threatening him, Milton pulled the blanket tighter around him, I guess to give himself comfort. So as he pulls this blanket tight around himself, he answers Turo's question to tell him about John, saying, he's dead. And Turo does not look happy at that answer, and he balls his fists like maybe he's going to punch Milton. And Milton, looking more and more terrified, says, He was a loner. At first I thought he liked to watch, but he didn't really. He liked things to happen to him, but he never initiated anything. And as he says that last line, we see a picture of John standing in a dark room with chains and hooks hanging from the ceiling and smoke all around him. And like he said, he's not doing anything. He's kind of waiting for something to happen to him. And then we see in the next panel that things do in fact happen to him as multiple men and women begin to pleasure John, and we get like a silhouette of that, and Milton narrates over that silhouette. He would let people do things, anything, and it was okay with him. And then Taro asks, what kind of things would you do to him, Milton? And Milton answers, nothing. I never do anything. Ask anybody. And Taro answers, I will. What kind of things were you not doing when the fire started? And Milton kind of pauses, and then he says hesitantly, I was being pissed on. I heard some screams. I didn't move. Screams mean nothing. But when the pissing suddenly stopped, I opened my eyes, and I remember I felt safe because I was wet, and I watched. He didn't do anything to put the fire out. And over Milton telling this, we do get some panels where we see Milton lying naked and wet on the ground, surrounded by some bulky men. And then his eyes are wide as he's seeing something very terrifying. And then we cut to a panel of a man in his trench coat burning to death. Now, I say a man because we can't see his face. We're assuming this is John because that's what we are told by the detective. But, you know, John's always got something up his sleeve. So we're just going to say it's a guy in a trench coat for now. And then Milton finishes his story with a big yawn saying, he just stood there and burned. Then Agent Taro goes over to the seat across the table from Milton, and he sits down and he asks, just stood there? Nobody around him holding a match? And then he strokes his chin for a second, and then he says, so Milton, tell me, you see a guy on fire, you get up, do something, lift a fucking finger, run away? And Taro wasn't really staring at Milton as he asked this because he was kind of pondering it to himself. And then he looks back over at Milton when there's a long pause, and he sees Milton's eyes are closed, and he says, Milton! And then he smacks the table really hard with his fist, and Milton wakes up, and he says, you tell me something, Agent Taro. What the fuck is wrong with doing nothing and just letting it happen to you? And Taro right there kind of realizes he's not going to get any more information out of Milton. And we turn the page and we cut to him having already left the interrogation room and walking through the door of the room next to it with the two-way glass. And in that room, we see Detective Havlick is standing there, and she had listened to most of that conversation. And as she's looking at her nails, she sarcastically says, case closed, as Frank walks in. And Frank fires back, open wide, detective. And it's kind of a sexual innuendo, so he's being very inappropriate. And she gets offended and says, excuse me? But Frank ignores that and just asks, who's next? So she walks him out to where all the witnesses are sitting in the police precinct, and she waves her hand towards them, and she says angrily, take your prick, agent. And Taro smiles at this, and then he looks at the people sitting on the benches and all the S&M gear, and there's one particular woman who's wearing some fetish gear. I'm not exactly sure what it's called, but basically it would be like a one-piece bathing suit, except there are holes cut where the breasts would be, so her breasts are hanging out, and she has small X's taped over her nipples, and she also has on some leather boots and some leather gloves. And like I said, Frank was smiling just seeing her, and as we zoom in on her, we also see that she's been crying because her mascara has been running, and he says, that one. And Detective Havlick just assumes he's picking that one because it's a busty lady with her breasts out, and she says, sucker for a damsel in distress, are you? And Agent Taro says, what? Oh, I get it. Didn't notice her tears? So Agent Frank Taro is kind of hard to get a read on. It seemed like he actually did some good detective work there because this was the only person sitting down who was crying, and that's why he wants to talk to her. But of course, we and Detective Havlick just assumed he wanted to talk to her because she's half naked. Then a man walks out of the shadows behind them, and he says, oh, fuck. And then Frank smiles. He doesn't even turn around. He knows who it is, and he says, hey, Gugliotti. But the man corrects him, saying, it's Gucati, Agent Taro. And Taro kind of chuckles to himself, and he says, it's what I said. Detective Havlick, this is Agent Gugliotti. He'll be conducting the autopsy. And as Taro puts his hand around Gucciardi and walks him down towards, I guess, the morgue, Detective Havlick's surprised, and she asks, what? Our coroner? But she's cut off by Taro, who says, Yeah, I'm sure Floyd does a great job in between haircuts, but we'll handle this one. And then he turns to Gucardi and he says, alone, okay? And Gucardi says, here I got a French fry. And Turo says, he's English if it's him. I'm not convinced. And Gucardi asks, why? And Turo answers, 'cause I'm not. Look, this guy is a grade A number fucking 1 con man. He's too oily to end up a lump of coal. And Gucardi asks, you throw him into the fire, Turo? And Turo doesn't answer, he just stays silent. And Gucardi walks away from him down to, I guess, the morgue, and he says, I'll call you when I have something. And Turo fires back, don't eat any evidence. Then we see Detective Havlicek appear behind him, and she asks Turo, can I ask you again, what's it about this horror show got you feds all interested? And Turo doesn't answer her, he just looks at her and says, no. Then we turn the page, and we cut to the interrogation room, where we see the dominatrix woman that Turo wanted to talk to sitting in the room with him, and he's standing next to her smiling, and she has a cigarette, and as she puffs on it, he says, so, Peggy, you okay? And she answers, yeah, no, I mean, thanks for the cigarette. Can I get another? And Frank asks, you knew Mr. Constantine? And Peggy answers, Johnny? And Frank says, yeah, John. And as she blows out a puff of smoke, she says, he was wonderful. And Frank says, that's a nice thing to say. And then we see another officer enter the room and hand her some cigarettes, and she says, I didn't mean it in a nice way. And Frank goes to sit down across the table from her, and he says, no? And she answers, no. He was a hungry man, Agent Turo. Every inch of him. And Turo says, hungry. And as she stamps out her cigarette, she says, voracious. And Turo asks, you ever cook for him? And as Peggy pulls out another cigarette, she says, no. He liked to eat out. And then as she puts the cigarette in her mouth, Agent Turo stands up and walks over to her, and he flicks out his lighter, and as he lights it, he says, really? Somebody did some cooking tonight. And then she asks, any idea who? And Turo answers, you tell me. And then he sits on the table next to her, and she says, God, so much was going on at once. I try to take it all in, but you can only be 5 places at one time, you know. And Frank's kind of confused, and he says, I don't think I do. So she blows out some smoke, and she opens her mouth and makes her lips into an O, and she says, 1. Then she holds up both her hands, and she says, 2, 3. Then she puts her hands down between her legs, and she says, 4. And then she adjusts herself in her seat, and we get a shot of her butt, and she says, 5. And Turo walks back over to his chair, and he crosses his legs, and he says, at one time? And Peggy answers, over and over and over, like John. He couldn't get enough. Then we get a panel of silhouette of Peggy and a silhouette of John. We'll call it kissing, but it looks like they're just kind of licking each other's tongues. Then we turn the page and we cut to the mansion of S.W. Manor. It is the middle of the night, and we see Manor standing in one of his rooms with a big window letting in some bright moonlight, and he's standing in front of a fireplace, and we hear Fredo, his assistant, say, Mr. Manor? And Manor answers, yes, Fredo. And Fredo says, your bath is ready. And as he says that line, we get a close-up shot of the back of S.W. Manor, and he's wearing like a white t-shirt, but also it's covered in stripes of blood, almost like someone has whipped him. And in response to his bath being ready, SW says, thank you. I'll be up in a few. And it seems like maybe Fredo's worried about him because he says, would you like... But SW cuts Fredo off saying, to be alone, Fredo. Then we get a panel of the front of SW Manor, and he is crying. Tears are running down his face, and he's staring at the mantle of a fireplace, and on that mantle is a clock. But not any clock. We've seen this clock before. It was from the little 2-part story about John in the past when he stole Rasputin's clock for a rich American guy. So somehow SW has either got this, or maybe he was related to, or maybe was the hidden buyer of this clock from that short storyline. But we'll have to wait until next issue to find out how this is all connected. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planes, trains, and comicbooks, all one word, at gmail.com. And we will see you on the next one.